today's Facebook Live. Today we're talking about carbon offsets and relevancy for farmers within WA. I'm joined today with my colleague Matilda Lloyd. Matilda's been charged with looking after our carbon legal aspects, so she's possibly got more knowledge than me on this topic.
We'll see.
And she's joining us today. So Matilda, can you run through the 5 key points that we'll cover today?
Yeah, so today we'll be looking at the Commonwealth's Emissions Reduction Fund. We'll then be looking at the state's funding package that it offers for carbon farming projects. We're then going to delve into the open market for selling your carbon credits. We'll look at mining tenements as well, and how carbon projects will be affected by mining activities. And then lastly, we'll look at some of the concerns that pastoralists and farmers have about undertaking carbon projects and also receiving an income from those projects.
Thanks, Matilda. And we'll wrap it up, I'm hoping, with some key points about the benefits of, say, carbon credits for WA farmers.
Yeah, absolutely.
If there are or if there aren't any. Okay, well, let's go to the first one, the Emissions Reduction Fund.
Sure.
What's all that about?
So the Emissions Reduction Fund is essentially a voluntary scheme, and it's aimed at reducing emissions by incentivising farmers or businesses or anyone undertaking projects and activities that are either going to reduce emissions or help to store carbon. And essentially what happens is, if you're undertaking these projects, there's the opportunity to generate Australian carbon credit units, which we call ACCUs.
Yep.
And you can generate income from them, either selling directly to the government or on the open market.
Yep.
And it's essentially the whole ERF scheme. The credits are managed and I suppose regulated by the Clean Energy Regulator.
Okay. And so what are eligible projects?
Well, it
typically
depends.
Yeah.
So there's a large number of measurements, measurement models, I should say, under the ERF scheme.
Yeah.
And under that scheme, there's different projects depending on the measurements. So typically you've got on-farm forestry. So if you're turning farming land into trees, and then you've got plantations. So if there's been land that's been used for plantations in the past or forestry activities, you can then plant trees again. And then you also have soil carbon projects.
Right. So when you say soil carbon projects, that's sequestering soil or a product that contains carbon into the soil.
Yeah, it's also looking at your farming practices, so whether that's stock rotations or whether that's managing your stubble and tillage.
Yeah.
They also contribute to carbon sequestration and helping to reduce emissions and store carbon in the soil.
Yeah. And so it's an interesting construct, I think, because there's 2 sides to this issue. One is the sequestration of carbon through trees and carbon product into the soil. And then there's the second aspect, which is emissions reduction. Are we really concerned, from a farming perspective, are we really concerned about reducing emissions?
Well, it's part of it. So I mean, ultimately our aim is to improve productivity, produce that biomass in the soil so that we get the benefit, so that our pasture gets the benefit, our livestock gets the benefit, and then maybe even our crops. The emissions is just a side benefit. So we're helping to contribute to reduction of emissions on our land, but also for Australia as a whole.
All right. And so I think you mentioned the second topic being what the state is doing. What's WA government doing?
So earlier this year, the McGowan government announced $15 million funding for carbon projects. So essentially the government set up 2 phases to assist farmers and pastoralists that are interested in undertaking carbon projects. So there's different funding schemes and different eligibility, but essentially they're providing funding, and in return the farmers or pastoralists have to deliver a certain amount or return a certain amount of carbon credits.
Right. Okay. How does that work in practical context?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is quite a vigorous process to registering a project. I mean, initially you've got to look at whether you can have a project on your property, whether your project's property is eligible. The particular funding that's just come out from the government focuses on the Southwest Land Division. So you have to be with that in area to get the funding, but there are projects elsewhere in WA that receive funding as well. I mean, a partnership or a family corporation, they can all undertake it, but it comes down to the measurement. So what activity you're actually doing, and whether that can be measured in accordance with the ERF measurement standards.
Yeah. And so to obtain a carbon credit, you've got to have a measurement system and then a measurable growth in either an emissions reduction or in carbon content within your soil or within the profile of trees on your farm.
That's
Is that
right.
correct?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. All right. And so you've generated these carbon credits. Great. What do you do with them?
Well, that's where you've got two options. You can either sell to the government through their contract abatements, or you can go to the open market. If you want to sell with the government, they usually hold about 2 auctions each year, in which case you can put up your credits and then sell them to the government, sell them to another business that's looking to reduce their emissions, or you go to the open market. And by open market, I mean there's this emergence of sort of carbon markets where you can, I suppose, advertise your credits and sell them to a large company like Microsoft or Facebook or something like that that's really trying to reduce their emissions, but haven't found their own ways of doing it.
Yeah. So can you give us an example of, say, a company that sold carbon credits perhaps to another business that was looking to offset emissions?
Absolutely. So Microsoft is actually in the forefront. So in 2021, Wilmot Cattle Company, which is a large cattle company over east, they have 3 properties, and it's still probably the biggest deal in terms of carbon credits within Australia. They sold about $500,000 worth of carbon credits to Microsoft. And they are quite unique. They did it in open market. They also went through the ERF scheme. But they had been recording data for a number of years leading up to selling to Microsoft. So that put them in a very unique position.
Right. Okay. Is there a bit of a quirk about obtaining funding from the WA government and having to sort of pay back through your carbon credits?
Yeah.
Is that part of the system in WA?
Absolutely. So I was going to raise this when we talk about concerns, but I'm glad you raised it now. So when you're selling on the open market or to a government, you have to really look at your contract. So essentially, once you've got your project approved, you've got your measurement model in, you're locked in, then a contract will come before you. And in that contract, there could be a reverse clause. So a reverse clause essentially means that if you aren't continually sequestering carbon, meeting the measurements that are required as part of your project, then there is a chance you may have to pay back those credits if you've already received them. And that can be, in the government's contract. It can also be in a private third-party contract.
All right. Well, whilst we're on this topic and dealing with concerns, the concern I have about these projects, and it's not only mirrored by me, it's a lot of farmers I've spoken to have a similar concern, it's the fact that you have to lock up your land for these projects for a minimum period of 25 years.
Yeah, the permanence period is definitely a concern. It was a concern for Wilmot Cattle Company, and it has been a concern for clients that have come to us with these sorts of issues, because it is, you're locking away for 25 years. Your contract is for 25 years, so essentially you're agreeing to sequester carbon, to measure it and maintain that for 25 years, and that is a concern, particularly if you're in a low rainfall area. And after 5-7 years, you might not be producing the same amount of, or sequestering the same amount of carbon as what you were doing in the first preliminary years.
Well, you might be going backwards.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, on that issue too, to me that creates this contest, I should say, that farmers need to really consider seriously about the value of production. Are they better off from a production perspective tying up their land to say trees for 25 years, or keeping utility of that land for crop and livestock? Right? So what's going to return the best for them over that period of time?
Well, obviously it's going to be dependent on your business, where your land is, and what your current farming business looks like. If you are ineligible for funding from the government, then you're going to have a huge cost to start these projects and then maintain them and then finish them. And so I suppose it's weighing up, like you said, whether it's worth allocating that a certain amount of land for tree planting or for a soil carbon project, or would you be better off focusing on your current program? I mean, the main argument is, of course, that the whole point of soil carbon projects is to improve your productivity, to improve your soil so you can be more productive in the future.
Yeah. But
again, it comes down to what's going to be best for your business.
Yeah, and we do know that particularly the lower southwest, a fair slice of the grain belt in WA is sand.
Exactly.
And whether it holds and retains carbon within that soil, even if you put it in, year out, there's a fair bit of science still left in that assessment, I suspect. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Matilda. The fourth point you raised was mining tenements and the impact of mining tenements, particularly in WA. Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we mentioned before, pastoralists are interested in carbon projects, but obviously pastoralists are on Crown land. Well, most of them are anyways. And so with that comes the issue of, if a mining company approaches you, or you have a mining tenement on your land, you're wanting to establish a carbon project, or you've already established one.
Under the ERF scheme.
Exactly.
Yep.
What are your options? So if you've already got a carbon project on your property and a mining company, wishes to explore, or they, make an application for a miscellaneous license, then you've kind of got to look at, the compensation. Because if it's affecting your carbon project, the amount of carbon you're sequestering, then you are allowed to seek compensation for that. And that would have to be, within that agreement that you reach between them. However, if there's already a mining tenement on your property and you're wishing to, establish a carbon project, the state has been pretty strict about whether or not, you can have a project, what area of land that's going to take up. Most cases, priority is given to...
Well, the state forces you to reach an agreement with the mining company that has an exploration licence or a mining tenement on your land. You're being forced to reach agreement with that company that you can, in fact, use that land that you're leasing from the government in a pastoral context to engage in this carbon sequestration offset process to generate ACCUs. To me, that's sort of trending away from assisting the pastoralists to better maximise use of their pastoral lease.
Yeah, but in saying that, there's a record number of pastoralists that have undertaken carbon projects and that have been approved by the state and registered. So, look, I think it just depends on the situation, and on those agreements, whether you can reach an agreement.
Yeah.
But it'll be an interesting space to watch going forward.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's good. All right, so we've dealt with some concerns. The 25-year mark, I forget what term you actually used for that.
Permanence period.
You've got the other issue we talked about earlier.
Costs.
Yep. And so in these schemes, typically you've got some pretty heavy upfront costs.
Yeah.
And with tree plantations, you might have some end costs as well that you need to factor in.
Yeah, exactly. So Phil and I have discussed, when it comes to the end of your 25 permanence period, or if it's before then, because, you haven't been able to continue that carbon sequestration, what are you going to do with the trees on your property? We've seen with blue gums that you've got to, clearing is a very expensive exercise and to pull out stumps. And so, the question arises, when these carbon projects end, what are you going to do with the land? Are you still going to use it for a carbon project? Are you going to register a new one? Are you able to with the existing, trees you have on your land, or do you have to clear them and start afresh?
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of discussion happening on this point because, carbon's really, being recognised for carbon credits and these projects are still at the early stages.
Yeah.
So we haven't got to that point where we're at the 25 years.
Yeah, well, that's true because the whole ERF scheme didn't start until about 2014, I think.
Yeah, so the legislation came in 2011 and then ERF soon after that. So.
Yeah. So you have this. There's another conundrum in all that too. That if you have trees already established on your property, you can't actually then. You're probably not going to be eligible to enter the ERF process.
Yeah.
Right. So there's this barrier where you might have already started a process and now you can't get that registered.
Yeah, that's correct. And it same goes for the state funding. They want you to establish a project from the beginning, so you can't take steps prior to beginning that registration process, because it's unlikely that you'll be granted, your project will be granted under the ERF. So that's something to be aware of. I mean, the Wilmot Cattle Company is a bit of a different story because they sold on the open market, and so they had their credits recognised before they went through the ERF. But that's not a usual scenario. So like Phil was saying, you really have to plan ahead and look at, starting the process of registering it before you start your project.
Yeah, okay. All right, so what's the upshot, Matilda? What's the upshot about, is this process, carbon credits, registering through the ERF program, trying to, increase your soil load your carbon load within your soil, or growing trees? Is this really going to benefit farmers in WA?
Well, I think you have to look at why we started carbon farming in the first place. The aim of it was to obviously reduce emissions, but primarily it was to improve your soils, to improve your productivity. And if that's your main goal, then carbon farming is worthwhile.
That's putting carbon in your soil.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I suppose the other side of it is you're monetising this commodity, carbon.
Yeah.
And there'll be some people out there that improving their productivity isn't their main focus. It's about getting the incentive from these carbon credits. So look, there's arguments on both sides. I think our main point is you've got to be aware going into this that it is a lengthy process and there are risks.
Yeah.
But I think it's worthwhile.
Yeah. What has Professor Richard Eckard said about converting grazing or grain growing land to trees?
Well, the moment you monetize it, you've stopped me there, Phil.
All right. Well, read your notes, Matilda.
The moment you put a monetary value on carbon in trees and soils, you've created an incentive for a broker in the middle to create a business model out of it.
Yeah.
And that's certainly what we've experienced. There's definitely been the emergence of brokers that have come up in the market.
Yeah.
And like I said, that's also something you have to take into consideration.
Yeah. And so there are people out there too that they, part of their specialty is to manage these carbon projects, right?
Yeah, indeed. It's managing them, also establishing them. So some people opt for having a carbon project developer to come onto their property and develop the whole process, manage it.
Yeah.
Obviously, farmers and pastoralists take it upon themselves to do it. So there's options out there, but again, if you're looking at a developer, there's costs associated with that. It's like any sort of other consultant or advisor.
Yeah.
So that's something to consider.
Yep. Okay, and ultimately be cautious about what you're actually entering into.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Matilda. So I think we'll probably wrap it up there. It's been a good session. Thank you, Matilda.
Thank you.
For our listeners, obviously, the usual spiel, what you've just heard is not legal advice, so please don't rely upon it in that context. And if you need assistance in relation to anything relating to carbon, please give us a call. We do free consultations and be happy to assist. All the best. Cheers.